The thunder of hooves echoed across the dusty plains like a death knell as Dahlia Vance clutched her swollen belly and froze in terror. The massive black stallion, nostrils flaring and eyes wild with panic, charged straight toward her with unstoppable momentum. In that moment, with the Montana sun beating down mercilessly, she knew her life and that of her unborn child hung in the delicate balance between beast and fate. Dahlia had ventured too far from the safety of her modest homestead on the outskirts of Ruby City, Montana territory. At 7 months along, she should have known better. But the wildflowers blooming in the spring of 1875 had beckoned her with their promise of beauty, a rare commodity since losing her husband Thomas to pneumonia 3 months prior. Now, paralyzed by fear, she could only watch as 1,000 pounds of untamed fury barreled toward her. The stallion's black mane whipped wildly in the wind, its powerful legs eating up the distance between them with terrifying speed. "Get down," a deep voice commanded from somewhere to her left. A blur of movement caught her peripheral vision as a tall figure on horseback raced alongside the charging stallion. The rider's duster coat flapped behind him like wings as he leaned dangerously from his saddle. In a display of skill and reckless courage, the man's hand shot out and grasped the trailing leather bridle of the runaway horse. His own mount responded perfectly to the subtle pressure of his knees, maintaining pace even as its rider performed this dangerous feat. The stallion fought violently, nearly pulling the man from his saddle. Dahlia gasped as she watched the struggle, her hands protectively covering her belly. The stranger spoke in low, soothing tones that she couldn't quite make out, but their effect on the stallion was immediate and astonishing. Gradually, the wild horse's pace slowed. Its eyes, though still alert, lost their manic gleam. The powerful creature that had seemed intent on destruction moments ago now stood trembling, allowing the stranger to stroke its neck with gentle hands. "Miss, are you all right?" The man called over to her, keeping his movements deliberately slow as he maintained his hold on the now calmer stallion. Dahlia's knees finally gave way as the danger passed, and she sank to the ground, her heart racing. "Yes," she managed, though her voice wavered. "Yes, I think so." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, looping his own horse's reins around a scrubby bush before approaching her. He led the black stallion with him, keeping a respectful distance. "You shouldn't be out here alone, madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal sun-bronzed features and eyes the color of the summer sky. His light brown hair fell in waves to his collar, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw. "Especially in your condition." "I know," Dahlia admitted, attempting to rise. A wave of dizziness overcame her, and she swayed dangerously. The stranger was at her side in an instant, one strong arm supporting her while his other hand maintained control of the stallion. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice as gentle as it had been with the wild horse. "I'm Colton Drake," he introduced himself. "I was tracking this fellow when he decided to make a break for it. He's been terrorizing ranches for miles around." "Dahlia Vance," she replied, finally managing to steady herself. "I live just over that rise. My husband," she stopped, the familiar pain clutching at her throat. "My late husband and I have a small homestead there." Something in Colton's expression shifted, a flash of empathy quickly masked. "Let me help you home, Mrs. Vance. This boy here has calmed down enough that I can lead him alongside." The walk back to her property was slow and careful. Dahlia was acutely aware of Colton's strong presence beside her, his vigilant eyes scanning the horizon as they walked. His horse followed dutifully behind, while the black stallion, though still alert, had surrendered to Colton's quiet authority. "What will you do with him?" Dahlia asked, nodding toward the stallion. "Depends," Colton replied, studying the magnificent animal. "He's too fine a horse to be left wild if he can be gentled. Someone must have owned him once. He's wearing a bridle, though it's worn and broken. Might have escaped during that big storm last month that scattered half the herds in the territory." As they crested the small rise, Dahlia's modest homestead came into view. A simple log cabin with a stone chimney stood alongside a small barn and corral. A vegetable garden, meticulously tended, stretched to one side. It wasn't much, but it had been home for the 2 years she and Thomas had lived there after moving west from Pennsylvania. "It's not much," Dahlia said, suddenly self-conscious of the property's humble appearance. "It's more than most have out here," Colton observed. "You've kept it up well." "Thomas was particular about things being maintained," she said softly. "I've tried to honor that." They reached the cabin, and Colton helped her to the porch before securing both horses and the stallion to the hitching post. "Thank you, Mr. Drake. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "Call me Colton, please," he insisted. "And I'm just glad I was tracking this fellow when I was." "Would you like to come in for some coffee?" Dahlia offered, surprising herself. She hadn't invited anyone into the cabin since the neighbors had stopped bringing food after Thomas's funeral. Colton hesitated, glancing at the stallion. "I should probably get this fellow secured somewhere better than your hitching post." "There's the corral," Dahlia pointed out. "It's sturdy enough. Thomas built it to last." After a moment's consideration, Colton nodded. "If you're sure it wouldn't be an imposition, I'd be obliged for that coffee." While Colton settled the horses, Dahlia made her way inside to stoke the fire and put the coffee pot on. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and not just from the lingering shock of her near miss with the stallion. There was something about Colton Drake that unsettled her. Not in a frightening way, but in a manner that made her acutely aware of herself for the first time in months. Since Thomas had fallen ill, and especially since his death, she'd moved through life like a ghost, going through the motions necessary to survive and protect her unborn child. Now, unexpectedly, she felt awake again. Through the window, she watched as Colton removed the stallion's damaged bridle and replaced it with a rope halter he fashioned from supplies in his saddlebags. His movements were confident but gentle, and the stallion, though still wary, allowed the handling with surprising docility. By the time Colton entered the cabin, the coffee was ready. He removed his hat once more and ducked slightly to enter through the doorway. "This is mighty kind of you," he said, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "Been on the trail 4 days now. Tracking that stallion all that time?" Dahlia asked, settling carefully into a chair. "Among other things," Colton answered vaguely. "I do some work for the Territorial Marshal's office. Tracking is part of it. You're a lawman?" "Not exactly." He took a sip of coffee. "I scout, track, and sometimes bring in fugitives that the regular deputies can't locate. Spent some years with the Army as a scout before that." "And the stallion, why track a horse?" Colton's expression darkened slightly. "That horse has been causing havoc across 3 counties. Stampeding cattle, destroying property. A child was injured last week when he charged through a farmyard. The territorial governor put out word that any problem animals need to be dealt with." "Dealt with?" Dahlia's hand instinctively went to her belly. "You mean killed?" Colton observed her protective gesture. "That's usually how it's handled, yes, but I had a notion this one might be salvageable. He's been trained before you can tell by how he responds to certain cues. Something's happened to make him fear humans, but he's not truly wild-born." "And now?" Dahlia asked, glancing toward the window where the black horse was visible in the corral. "Now I'm not sure," Colton admitted. "I was planning to take him to the livery in Ruby City, see if anyone recognizes him or wants to claim him. If not," he shrugged, "might try working with him myself for a spell." A comfortable silence fell between them as they sipped their coffee. Dahlia found herself studying Colton's hands, strong and capable, with calluses that spoke of hard work, yet they had been so gentle with both her and the horse. "How far along are you?" Colton asked suddenly, his eyes on her rounded middle. 7 months, Dahlia replied. "The doctor in town says everything looks to be progressing well, and you're managing the place alone." There was no judgment in his tone, only concern, but Dahlia bristled slightly nonetheless. "I've managed just fine. The neighbors check in, and I've hired the Washburn boy from the next homestead over to help with the heavier work." Colton nodded thoughtfully. "It's not easy what you're doing." "Takes courage." "Not courage," Dahlia corrected softly. "Necessity." "Sometimes they're the same thing." He finished his coffee and rose. "I should be getting on. Got to reach Ruby City before dark if I can." "Of course." Dahlia stood as well, too quickly, and swayed slightly. Colton steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Are you sure you're all right, Mrs. Vance? That was quite a scare you had." "Dahlia, please," she said. "And yes, I'm fine, just stood up too fast." He looked unconvinced. "If you don't mind my saying so, you look pale. Maybe you should rest a while." "I have chores that need doing," she protested. "The chickens need feeding, and I could see to that before I go," Colton offered. "Least I can do for the coffee." Dahlia hesitated, pride warred with practicality. Finally, she nodded. "That would be kind of you." "The feed's in the barn." Colton spent the next hour doing not just the chores Dahlia had mentioned, but several others he noticed needed attention. He repaired a loose board on the chicken coop, filled the water trough for the 2 milk cows in the back pasture, and split a small pile of firewood. Watching from the porch, Dahlia felt a strange mix of gratitude and discomfort. It had been months since a man had worked around her place. The local boys Thomas had sometimes hired were helpful but lacked the confident capability Colton displayed. When he finally prepared to leave, the sun was lower in the sky than he'd planned. The stallion had remained calm in the corral, occasionally nickering to Colton's own mount. "I appreciate your help today," Dahlia said as Colton saddled his horse. "More than I can say." "It wasn't much," he replied, adjusting the cinch. "But I'd feel better about leaving if you'd promise not to wander so far from the house alone again." Dahlia smiled faintly. "I've learned my lesson about that." Colton hesitated, looking at the stallion. "I hate to impose further, but I've been thinking. That corral of yours is more secure than anything I'd find in town. Would it be an imposition if I left the stallion here for a day or two? I need to report to the marshal's office, and I can come back with proper equipment to transport him." "You want to leave him here?" Dahlia asked, surprised. "He seems settled now, and moving him again might undo the progress. Plus, the livery in town is overcrowded with the cattle drives coming through." He looked at her directly. "But I won't if you're uncomfortable with it." "He's calmer now, but he's still a handful." Dahlia considered the request. The stallion did indeed seem calmer, grazing peacefully in the corral that had stood empty since Thomas's workhorse had been sold to pay for medicines during his illness. "I suppose it would be all right," she agreed finally. "But what about food for him?" "I noticed you have hay in the barn," Colton said. "I'd compensate you for it, of course, and I'll be back tomorrow or the day after at the latest." Something in Dahlia warmed at the prospect of seeing Colton again, a feeling she quickly suppressed. That would be acceptable. Colton mounted his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "Thank you, Dahlia, I'm in your debt." "You saved my life today," she reminded him. "I think that more than balances any debt between us." He tipped his hat, a half-smile playing across his features. "Even so, I'll be back soon." Dahlia watched as he rode away, his straight-backed figure gradually diminishing with distance. Only when he had disappeared over the horizon did she turn her attention to the black stallion, who watched her warily from the corral. "Well," she said softly to the horse, "it seems we're to be companions for a spell." That night, Dahlia slept better than she had in months, despite the occasional nickering from the corral that drifted through her open window. She dreamed of thundering hooves and strong hands and woke feeling oddly refreshed. The stallion seemed to have accepted his temporary housing, though he remained alert and watchful whenever Dahlia approached the corral fence. She kept a respectful distance, mindful of Colton's warnings about the animal's unpredictable nature. By mid-afternoon of the following day, Dahlia found herself glancing repeatedly toward the road that led to Ruby City, though she told herself she was merely watching for any sign of the Washburn boy, who was late for his usual chores. When young Ethan Washburn finally arrived, his freckled face was animated with excitement. "Mrs. Vance, did you hear about the bank robbery?" he asked without preamble as he dismounted from his pony. "Bank robbery," Dahlia echoed, her hand going instinctively to her throat. "In Ruby City." "Yes, yesterday afternoon, just before closing time, 3 men rode in and held up Mr. Finch and took all the money." Ethan's eyes were wide with the drama of it all. "Pa says they got away with nearly $800. Was anyone hurt?" Dahlia asked, concern creasing her brow. "No, madam, But Pa says the marshals formed a posse to track them. They think the robbers headed north toward the Montana border. A chill ran through Dahlia as she realized that Colton had likely been drawn into the pursuit. It would explain why he hadn't returned as planned. "I see," she said quietly. "Well, Ethan, the chicken coop needs cleaning today, and if you have time, that fence near the vegetable garden could use some mending." As the boy set to work, Dahlia found herself worrying about Colton. Bank robbers were dangerous men, desperate and often willing to kill to avoid capture. The thought of Colton facing such danger made her stomach knot uncomfortably. By the third day, with no sign of Colton, Dahlia had begun to develop a routine with the stallion. Though she never entered the corral, she would bring him fresh water and hay, speaking softly to him as she worked around the fence line. "You're a magnificent creature," she told him as she poured water into the trough through the fence. "I can see why Colton thought you worth saving." The stallion's ears pricked forward at the sound of Colton's name, and Dahlia wondered if the horse somehow associated the name with the man who had calmed him. "He'll be back," she assured the horse, though she was beginning to wonder if that was true. On the morning of the fourth day, Dahlia woke to the sound of hoofbeats approaching her homestead. Heart pounding with anticipation, she quickly dressed and hurried outside, only to find Marshal Jenkins from Ruby City dismounting from his horse. "Mrs. Vance," the graying lawman greeted her, removing his hat. "Sorry to disturb you so early." "Marshal," Dahlia acknowledged, her disappointment carefully masked. "What brings you all the way out here?" Jenkins's eyes drifted to the corral where the black stallion stood watching them. "I see Drake left that devil horse here after all. That's partly why I've come." "Is something wrong?" Dahlia asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "Is Colton Mr. Drake all right?" "He's alive," Jenkins said grimly, "but not what I'd call all right. He took a bullet during the pursuit of those bank robbers. He's at Doc Sullivan's place in town." The blood drained from Dahlia's face. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough. Caught him in the shoulder and he lost a fair amount of blood before they got him back to town." The marshal sighed heavily. "He's been asking about that horse, though. Even half delirious, he was worried about whether the animal was behaving itself." "The stallion has been quite calm," Dahlia said, her thoughts racing. "How long will Mr. Drake be indisposed?" Jenkins shrugged. "Doc says at least a couple weeks before he should even think about riding again. The wound needs time to heal proper, or he risks losing the use of that arm." "I see," Dahlia murmured, glancing at the stallion. "Please tell Mr. Drake not to worry about the horse. He can stay here until Mr. Drake is recovered." The marshal eyed her skeptically. "That's mighty generous, Mrs. Vance, but are you sure? That beast has a reputation, and in your condition." "I'm being careful," Dahlia assured him, "and the animal seems to have settled in well here." After the marshal left, promising to relay her message to Colton, Dahlia stood for a long time at the corral fence, watching the stallion graze. Her mind was filled with thoughts of Colton lying wounded in town, and a decision began to form. The next morning, Dahlia hitched her wagon and drove carefully into Ruby City. At just over 5 miles, the journey wasn't long, but it was the first time she'd made it alone since Thomas's death. The stallion had seemed agitated at her departure, pacing the corral anxiously. Ruby City, named optimistically by its founders after a minor gemstone discovery that had played out within a year, was a modest settlement by 1875 standards. A main street lined with false-fronted businesses, a church, a school, and scattered dwellings comprised the heart of the community. The railroad had bypassed them in favor of Granite Creek, 20 miles south, ensuring Ruby City would never grow beyond its current size. Dahlia drove directly to Dr. Sullivan's combined home and office at the edge of town. The doctor's wife, Martha, answered her knock with a surprised expression. "Dahlia Vance, should you be traveling in your condition?" the older woman asked, ushering her inside. "I'm perfectly fine, Martha," Dahlia assured her. "I've come to see Mr. Drake, if that's possible." Martha's eyebrows rose. "The tracker." "He's awake this morning, but Henry's been limiting visitors." "It's about the horse Mr. Drake left in my care," Dahlia explained. "I wanted to give him an update personally." Whether Martha believed this reason or not, she nodded and led Dahlia to a small room at the back of the house. "Don't tire him out," she cautioned before opening the door. Colton was propped up against several pillows, his left shoulder and upper chest heavily bandaged. His normally tanned face was pale, making the stubble on his jaw stand out starkly. He looked up as the door opened, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw Dahlia. "Mrs. Vance," he said, attempting to sit up straighter and wincing at the movement. "Please don't strain yourself," Dahlia said quickly, moving to the chair beside the bed. "And I thought we had agreed on Dahlia." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Dahlia, then, what are you doing in town?" "Marshal Jenkins told me what happened," she explained. "I wanted to assure you personally that the Stallion is fine. He's settled in well at my place." Relief visibly washed over Colton's features. "I'm sorry I couldn't return as promised. Things got complicated." "So I heard. Bank robbers," he nodded grimly. "We caught up to them near the border. They didn't surrender peacefully." Dahlia's eyes were drawn to the bandages. Clearly not. "It could have been worse," Colton said matter-of-factly. "Nichols, one of the deputies, didn't make it." Dahlia inhaled sharply. "I'm so sorry." "Risk of the job," Colton replied, though the tightness around his eyes suggested the loss weighed on him. "About the Stallion, I'll make arrangements to have someone collect him as soon as I'm able." "There's no need," Dahlia said quickly. "He can stay as long as necessary. In fact," she hesitated, then pressed on, "I've been thinking you'll need somewhere to recuperate once Dr. Sullivan releases you. My cabin has a spare room that was meant to be the nursery, but it won't be needed for that for some months yet. You'd be welcome to use it while you recover." Colton stared at her, clearly taken aback. "That's extremely generous, but I couldn't impose on you like that. Especially with your condition." "It's not an imposition," Dahlia insisted. "In fact, it would be helpful to have someone around the place, even if they're not fully able-bodied, and you'd be closer to the Stallion, able to work with him as you heal." "People would talk," Colton pointed out, his blue eyes searching her face. "People already talk," Dahlia replied with a slight shrug. "I'm a widow living alone and expecting a child. Nothing I do will stop the gossip." For a long moment, Colton seemed to struggle with the offer. Finally, he asked, "Why would you do this for a virtual stranger?" Dahlia met his gaze steadily. "You saved my life, and perhaps I'm tired of the silence in my home." Something shifted in Colton's expression, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred loneliness. After another moment of consideration, he nodded slowly. "If you're certain, and if Doc Sullivan approves, I'd be grateful for the arrangement, but only until I'm well enough not to be a burden." "Then it's settled," Dahlia said, rising. "I'll speak with the doctor on my way out, Doctor." Sullivan was skeptical but eventually agreed that once Colton's fever risk had passed likely another 3 or 4 days, he could continue his recovery at Dahlia's homestead, provided he returned weekly for checkups. True to the doctor's prediction, 4 days later, Dahlia returned to town with her wagon to transport Colton to her homestead. He was weak but determined to walk from the doctor's house to the wagon under his own power, though Dr. Sullivan and Dahlia both hovered anxiously at his sides. The journey back was slow and careful, with Dahlia avoiding every rut and bump she could to spare Colton unnecessary pain. He sat beside her on the wagon seat, his right arm braced against the jolting motion, his face set in lines of controlled discomfort. "Almost there," Dahlia assured him as they crested the final rise that would bring her homestead into view. As the cabin and outbuildings appeared before them, Colton straightened slightly, his gaze immediately finding the corral where the black stallion paced. "He looks good," Colton observed. "Has he been eating well?" "Very well," Dahlia confirmed. "And he's calmer each day, though he still won't let me touch him." A faint smile touched Colton's lips. "He's not a pet, Dahlia. He's a wild thing learning to trust again." "Aren't we all?" she murmured, so softly that Colton wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Getting Colton settled in the small room that would eventually become the nursery was a careful process. The fever had left him weaker than he liked to admit, and the jolting wagon ride had clearly taxed his endurance. By the time Dahlia had helped him to sit on the narrow bed, his face was ashen with pain and exhaustion. You should rest, she told him firmly. Doctor's orders. I'll bring you something to eat later. Too tired to argue, Colton merely nodded and carefully leaned back against the pillows Dahlia had arranged. In the days that followed, a routine developed between them. Dahlia would rise early to prepare breakfast, then help Colton to the table if he felt strong enough to join her. Often, he would sit on the porch afterward, watching as she tended her garden or fed the chickens, frustration evident in his expression at his own inability to assist. By the end of the first week, Colton was strong enough to walk to the corral on his own, where he would stand talking softly to the stallion for long stretches. The horse seemed to remember him, approaching the fence cautiously but without the wariness it showed toward Dahlia. He needs a name, Colton said one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the stallion prance around the corral in the golden light of sunset. You're the one who caught him, Dahlia pointed out. You should name him. Colton considered the animal thoughtfully. Tempest, maybe. For the storm in his soul. Tempest, Dahlia repeated, watching as the stallion tossed his head, his black mane catching the dying sunlight. It suits him. As another week passed, Colton's strength returned gradually. The color came back to his face, and he began to take on small tasks around the homestead, things he could manage one-handed or with limited movement of his injured arm. He repaired tack in the barn, supervised Ethan Washburn's work more effectively than Dahlia had been able to, and even began the slow process of gentling Tempest. Dahlia found herself watching Colton more often than she should, admiring the patient way he worked with the stallion. He never pushed the animal beyond its comfort, never rushed the process of building trust. Each day he would stand a little closer to Tempest in the corral, speak a little longer, move with deliberate slowness until the horse allowed him to touch its nose, then its neck, then eventually to run his hand along its powerful flank. It's like magic, Dahlia commented one afternoon, watching from the corral fence as Tempest allowed Colton to check each of his hooves. How did you learn to do this? My father raised horses in Texas, Colton explained, straightening carefully to avoid pulling at his healing wound. Had a way with the difficult ones, said it was about respecting their nature, not trying to break it. Your father sounds like a wise man. A shadow passed over Colton's features. He was. Comanche raid took him when I was 16. Mother had passed the year before, so I joined the army as a scout, seemed the sensible thing given my tracking skills. I'm sorry, Dahlia said softly. About your parents, Colton shrugged his good shoulder. It was a long time ago. What about your family? Anyone back east missing you? My mother still lives in Pennsylvania, Dahlia replied. My father passed when I was young. I write to Mother regularly, but she never approved of Thomas bringing me west. She thought it too dangerous for a proper young lady from a good Philadelphia family. And was it too dangerous? Colton asked, his eyes holding hers. Dahlia considered the question seriously. Sometimes, but also beautiful and free in ways Philadelphia never was. Her hand went to her rounded belly. I don't regret coming, even with everything that's happened. In the third week of Colton's stay, Dr. Sullivan made the journey from Ruby City to check on his patient. He pronounced himself cautiously satisfied with the healing wound, but warned that full recovery would take at least another month. No riding, no heavy lifting, and certainly no chasing outlaws, the doctor instructed sternly. And come back to town in 2 weeks so I can check that wound again. After the doctor left, Dahlia found Colton sitting on the porch, his expression troubled. Is something wrong? She asked, settling carefully into the chair beside him. I've imposed on your hospitality far too long already, he said quietly. Another month feels unconscionable. It's no imposition, Dahlia assured him. In fact, she hesitated, then continued more softly. In fact, I've found your presence here quite comforting. Colton turned to look at her, something unreadable in his blue eyes. Have you? Yes, she admitted. The house was so quiet after Thomas died, empty in a way that echoed, having someone else here even just to talk with in the evenings. She shrugged slightly. It helps. For a long moment, Colton said nothing, his gaze returning to the distant horizon. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I've been alone most of my adult life, moving from place to place, taking whatever work comes my way. It's been a long while since I've stayed anywhere long enough to feel settled. And do you, Dahlia asked, feel settled here? A slight smile touched his lips. More than I probably should. That evening, as Dahlia prepared supper, she was acutely aware of Colton sitting at the table, whittling a small piece of wood with his good hand. The domestic scene struck her with unexpected poignancy. This could have been her life with Thomas, had he lived. Yet it wasn't Thomas sitting at her table, but a man she'd known less than a month, a man whose presence filled the cabin in ways Thomas's never had. The realization brought a flush of guilt that Dahlia quickly suppressed. She was allowed to find comfort where she could. Thomas would have wanted that for her, wouldn't he? Something smells wonderful, Colton commented, looking up from his whittling. Just venison stew, Dahlia replied. From the deer Ethan's father brought by yesterday. You're a fine cook, Colton said. Among your many talents, the compliment warmed her cheeks. Hardly many. I can cook, garden, and keep chickens from killing each other. Not exactly impressive skills. You're selling yourself short, Colton countered. You've maintained this homestead alone for months while carrying a child. That takes strength most men don't possess. Dahlia turned from the stove to face him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. Thank you. That means a great deal coming from someone like you. Someone like me, Colton echoed, his head tilted questioningly. Someone self-sufficient, capable? Dahlia gestured vaguely with the wooden spoon in her hand. You've made your way in a dangerous world on your own terms. That's admirable. A curious expression crossed Colton's face, something between surprise and discomfort, as though he wasn't accustomed to praise. It's just been the life I've known, he said simply, not sure how admirable it is. That night, after they'd finished supper and Dahlia had insisted on clearing up alone despite Colton's offers to help, they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The evening was mild for late spring, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes at bay. I've been thinking, Colton said after a comfortable silence, about Tempest. Oh, Dahlia turned slightly to look at him, his profile illuminated by the soft glow from the cabin window behind them. He's coming along well with the training. Another few weeks and he'll be rideable, I think. He's intelligent, responsive. That's wonderful, Dahlia said, genuinely pleased. You've done amazingly with him. Which brings me to a proposition, Colton continued. When I'm fully recovered and move on, as I eventually must, I'd like to leave Tempest with you. Dahlia's eyes widened. Leave him with me, but he's yours. You caught him, trained him. I have no permanent place to keep a horse, Colton explained. And with your husband gone, you'll need a good mount more than I will, especially with a child coming. The stallion is strong enough to pull your wagon when needed, but fast enough to get you to town quickly in an emergency. I don't know what to say, Dahlia murmured, genuinely moved by the offer. But surely he's valuable. You could sell him in town for a good price. Colton shook his head firmly. I didn't save him from being destroyed just to sell him to the highest bidder. Besides, I like the thought of him being here with someone who appreciates his spirit. Their eyes met in the dim light, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that Colton's words applied to more than just the horse. The moment stretched, trembling with possibility, until Dahlia finally looked away, her heart beating faster than it should. Thank you, she said softly. I'd be honored to give Tempest a home. The next morning, Dahlia woke to the sound of rain drumming on the cabin roof. The spring shower had turned the yard into a muddy expanse and sent the chickens hurrying for shelter in their coop. Pulling her shawl tightly around her shoulders, Dahlia made her way to the kitchen to start the fire in the stove. Colton appeared a few minutes later, his hair tousled from sleep, moving more easily than he had in previous weeks. Quite a downpour, he observed, peering through the window. Good for your garden, at least. If it doesn't wash everything away, Dahlia replied, measuring coffee into the pot. The creek tends to rise quickly with heavy rain. Concern furrowed Colton's brow. The bridge to town should be fine unless the rain continues all day, Dahlia assured him. But we might need to check the livestock in the lower pasture if it doesn't let up soon. After breakfast, despite the continued rain, Colton insisted on accompanying Dahlia to check on the animals. They donned oilskin slickers that had belonged to Thomas, the coat comically large on Dahlia's frame even with her advanced pregnancy. The rain had indeed caused the small creek that ran along the edge of Dahlia's property to swell, though not yet dangerously. The two milk cows and their calves had wisely sought shelter beneath a stand of cottonwoods on higher ground. They seem fine for now, Colton said, water dripping from the brim of his hat. But we should move them to the upper pasture if this keeps up. As they made their way back toward the cabin, Dahlia's foot slipped in the mud, and she would have fallen if not for Colton's quick reflexes. His right arm caught her around the waist, pulling her against him to steady her. For a breathless moment, they stood like that in the rain, Colton's arm firm around her, Dahlia's hands braced against his chest, their faces inches apart. Dahlia was acutely aware of the solid strength of him, the warmth of his body even through the wet slickers, the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Careful," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "Don't want you falling in your condition." "No," Dahlia agreed, unable to look away from his intense blue gaze. "Thank you." Slowly, reluctantly, Colton released her, though his hand remained hovering near her elbow as they continued toward the cabin, as if ready to catch her again at the slightest misstep. Back inside, they shed their wet outer garments and set them to dry by the fire. An odd tension lingered between them, something new and fragile that neither seemed willing to acknowledge directly. The rain continued through the day and into the evening. After supper, as they sat before the fire, Colton returned to his whittling project, which was beginning to take the shape of a small horse. "Is that Tempest?" Dahlia asked, her hands busy with mending. Colton nodded, turning the small figure in his fingers. "Thought your little one might like a toy when they arrive." The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Dahlia deeply. "That's very kind. It's the least I can do, given your hospitality." He worked in silence for a few moments, then added quietly, "My father used to carve toys for the children on neighboring ranches, said every child deserves something made just for them." "Your father sounds like he was a good man," Dahlia observed. "The best I've known," Colton confirmed. "He taught me everything worthwhile I know: how to track, how to gentle a horse, how to read the weather and the land." He paused, a distant look in his eyes, "and how to treat people with respect, regardless of their station." "You've honored his teachings well," Dahlia said softly. Colton's eyes met hers, something vulnerable flickering in their depths. "I try to, not always successfully." The moment was interrupted by a sharp kick from Dahlia's unborn child, strong enough to make her gasp and press a hand to her side. "Are you all right?" Colton asked, immediately concerned. "Yes," Dahlia assured him, laughing slightly. "Just a very enthusiastic kick." Here, without thinking, she reached for his hand and placed it where the baby was moving. For a second, Colton seemed frozen in surprise, but then the baby kicked again and his expression transformed into one of wonder. "That's remarkable," he breathed, his large hand gentle against the curve of her belly. Dahlia watched his face, seeing in it an innocence and awe that contrasted sharply with the hardened tracker and sometimes lawman she'd come to know. In that moment, he seemed younger, unburdened by whatever ghosts normally haunted his eyes. When the baby stilled, Colton slowly withdrew his hand, something like embarrassment crossing his features. "Forgive me, that was presumptuous." "Not at all," Dahlia assured him. "It's nice to share it with someone, the miracle of it, I mean." Outside, the rain finally began to slacken, the drumming on the roof fading to a gentle patter. In the sudden quiet, the crackling of the fire seemed louder, more intimate. "I should turn in," Colton said abruptly, rising from his chair. "Dawn comes early." Dahlia nodded, trying to ignore the disappointment that washed through her at his withdrawal. "Of course. Good night, Colton." "Good night, Dahlia," he replied, his voice softer than it had been a moment before. He paused at the door to his room, looking back at her with an unreadable expression. "Thank you for everything." Before she could respond, he had disappeared into the small room, leaving Dahlia alone with the fire and her thoughts. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the rain having washed the world clean. The creek had risen but not overflowed, and apart from some minor erosion along the garden edge, Dahlia's property had weathered the storm well. Colton was quieter than usual as they went about the morning chores, a thoughtfulness to his manner that made Dahlia wonder what was on his mind. She didn't have to wonder long. As they finished breakfast, Colton cleared his throat. "I've been thinking it might be time for me to return to town. Dr. Sullivan said I'm healing well and I don't want to overstay my welcome." The announcement, though not entirely unexpected, still took Dahlia by surprise. "You're certainly welcome to stay until you're fully recovered," she said carefully. "Dr. Sullivan said another couple of weeks at least." "I know, and I'm grateful." Colton's fingers tapped restlessly on the table. "But I've been away from my duties for nearly a month now. The marshal's office has been patient, but there's work waiting." "I see," Dahlia said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "When would you leave? Tomorrow, perhaps, or the next day?" His eyes met hers briefly before looking away. "I'd still come out regularly to work with Tempest, of course, if that's agreeable to you." "Of course," Dahlia agreed, rising to clear the dishes with more force than necessary. "This is your home as long as you need it, but you're free to go when you wish." Colton winced slightly at her tone. "Dahlia, he stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. "Thank you for understanding." That afternoon, Dahlia found reasons to stay busy in the garden, avoiding the corral where Colton was working with Tempest. Her emotions were a tangled mess that she wasn't ready to sort through. Part of her recognized the sensibility of Colton's decision. He had his own life, his own responsibilities. But another part, a part that had grown stronger over the weeks of his stay, rebelled against his leaving. It wasn't just the practical help he provided, though that had been invaluable. It was his company, his quiet strength, the way he listened when she spoke as if every word mattered. The cabin would seem emptier without him, the silence heavier. By supper time, Dahlia had composed herself enough to be civil, even friendly. They ate together as usual, talking of ordinary things: the weather, the garden's progress, Tempest's training. But beneath the normalcy lay a current of unspoken feelings, questions neither seemed ready to ask. "I've been meaning to tell you," Colton said as they finished the meal. "Marshal Jenkins sent word that they identified those bank robbers. Turned out they were the same gang that's been hitting small towns across 3 territories. There was a reward posted that I didn't know about." "A reward?" Dahlia echoed. Colton nodded. $200 for information leading to their capture. "Since I tracked them and was part of the posse that brought them in or tried to, the marshal says I'm entitled to the money." "That's wonderful," Dahlia said sincerely. "You certainly earned it." "I've been thinking about what to do with it," Colton continued, his eyes intent on hers. "And I'd like to use part of it to hire someone to help around here for the next few months. Someone more capable than young Ethan, who can handle the heavier work you shouldn't be doing, especially as your time approaches." Dahlia stared at him, stunned by the offer. "Colton, that's extremely generous, but I couldn't possibly accept." "Please," he interrupted. "It would ease my mind to know you had proper help. Jensen at the livery in town has a nephew looking for work. Solid young man, good with animals. He could come out 3 or 4 days a week." "Why would you do this?" Dahlia asked softly, genuinely bewildered by his generosity. Something vulnerable flickered in Colton's eyes. "Because I care what happens to you. To both of you," he added, his gaze dropping briefly to her rounded belly. The simple admission hung in the air between them, fraught with implications neither seemed ready to explore fully. "Thank you," Dahlia finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would be grateful for the help." That night, sleep eluded Dahlia. She lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the homestead, the occasional lowing of the cows, the soft nickering of Tempest in the corral, the creaking of the cabin timbers as they settled. And beneath it all, the awareness of Colton's presence in the next room, separated from her by only a thin wall. Tomorrow or the next day he would leave. Life would return to what it had been before his arrival, yet not the same at all. Because now she knew what it was to have him here, to share meals and conversations, to watch the sun set together from the porch. The absence of those things would be a new kind of loneliness. When morning came, Dahlia rose early, determined to face the day with composure. She had survived Thomas's death. She could certainly handle Colton's departure with dignity. She found him already outside, checking Tempest's hooves in the corral. The stallion stood calmly, accepting Colton's handling with the trust that had developed between them. "Good morning," Dahlia called, approaching the fence. Colton straightened, offering her a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Morning, you're up early. Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Have you decided about leaving today?" He nodded slowly. "I think it's best. I spoke with Jensen's nephew yesterday when he delivered the feed. He'll start coming out tomorrow, 3 days a week to begin with." "I see." Dahlia's fingers tightened on the fence rail. "Well, I'll prepare some food for your journey." "You don't have to, I want to," she interrupted firmly. "It's the least I can do." The morning passed in a blur of ordinary tasks performed with extraordinary awareness that each was the last of its kind, the last breakfast they would share at her table. The last time they would feed the chickens together. The last moments of the comfortable routine they had established. By mid-morning, Colton had saddled his horse and packed his few belongings. He stood awkwardly by the hitching post, his injured arm still held somewhat stiffly at his side. "I'll be back in a few days to check on Tempest," he promised, "and to see how Jensen's nephew is working out." "We'll be fine," Dahlia assured him, struggling to maintain her composure. "Truly." Colton shifted his weight, his eyes moving past her to the cabin, then to the corral where Tempest watched them with pricked ears, then finally back to her face. "Dahlia," he began, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with his words. "I want you to know that these weeks here, they've meant a great deal to me as well," she admitted softly. "I haven't had a place that felt like a home in many years." His voice was rough with emotion he clearly wasn't accustomed to expressing. "Your kindness, your strength, they've been a gift I didn't expect and certainly don't deserve." "Don't say that," Dahlia protested. "You deserve every kindness, Colton." He shook his head slightly, a shadow crossing his features. "You don't know everything about me, the things I've done." "I know enough," she insisted. "I know you're a good man. I've seen it in how you treat Tempest and how you've helped me in 1,000 small ways." For a long moment, Colton said nothing, his blue eyes searching her face as if memorizing every detail. Finally, he reached out and took her hand in his touch gentle but firm. "I'll be back," he promised again, his voice low and intense, "not just for Tempest." Dahlia's heart quickened at his words, at the warmth of his hand enveloping hers. "I'll hold you to that." With visible reluctance, Colton released her hand and mounted his horse. With a final nod, he turned the animal toward the road and rode away, not looking back. Dahlia watched until he disappeared from view, one hand unconsciously cradling her belly, the other pressed against the ache in her chest. The days that followed were both better and worse than Dahlia had anticipated. Better because Jensen's nephew, a sturdy young man named Paul, proved to be a reliable worker who needed little supervision. Worse because the cabin seemed to echo with Colton's absence, each room containing memories of his presence that haunted Dahlia at unexpected moments. True to his word, Colton returned 4 days after his departure, riding up to the homestead in late afternoon. Dahlia was in the garden when he arrived and tried to ignore the leap of her heart at the sight of him dismounting by the corral. "How's our boy doing?" He called to her, nodding toward Tempest, who had trotted to the fence at his approach. "Missing you, I think," Dahlia replied, setting aside her basket of vegetables and making her way over to him. "He's been restless." Colton's eyes assessed her carefully. "And you, how have you been?" "Well enough," she answered, avoiding the deeper question in his gaze. "Paul has been a tremendous help. Thank you for arranging that." Colton nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I'm glad. And how's the little one?" His eyes dropped briefly to her belly. "Active," Dahlia said with a small smile. "Especially at night when I'm trying to sleep." "May I?" Colton gestured toward the corral. "I'd like to work with Tempest a bit while I'm here, of course." "This is still your home, I mean." Dahlia stumbled over the words, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "You're always welcome here." Something softened in Colton's expression. "Thank you, Dahlia." For the next 2 hours, Dahlia busied herself with household tasks while keeping an eye on Colton and Tempest through the window. The stallion had indeed missed Colton, showing none of the wariness that had marked their early interactions. By the time the sun began to set, Colton had even managed to sit briefly on Tempest's back while the horse stood calmly in the corral. "He's coming along beautifully," Colton told Dahlia as he joined her on the porch. "Another week or two and he'll be fully trained." "You have a remarkable gift," Dahlia observed. "Will you stay for supper? It's almost ready." Colton hesitated. "I don't want to impose." "It's no imposition," Dahlia assured him. "In fact, I made extra, hoping you might stay." That earned her a genuine smile. "In that case, I'd be honored." The meal that followed was both familiar and different from the many they had shared during Colton's recovery. The same table, the same simple food, but now weighted with unspoken feelings and the awareness of their temporary nature. "How are things in town?" Dahlia asked as they ate. "Quiet, for the most part," Colton replied. "The bank's got a new teller from back East City fellow who looks like he's never seen dirt before." He smiled slightly. "Marshal Jenkins has me training some of the younger deputies in tracking, says they rely too much on luck and not enough on skill. And your shoulder, is it healing well?" Colton rotated the arm in question. "Getting there. Still sore if I push too hard, but better every day." The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on various topics but carefully avoiding the deeper questions that hovered beneath the surface. How long would Colton stay in Ruby City? What would happen once Tempest was fully trained? What was the nature of the connection they both felt but neither had named? As the evening drew to a close, Colton helped Dahlia clear the dishes despite her protests. Their hands brushed occasionally in the process, each brief contact sending a jolt of awareness through Dahlia that she tried to ignore. "I should head back to town," Colton said finally, reluctance evident in his tone. "It'll be full dark soon." "Yes, of course," Dahlia agreed, though everything in her wanted to ask him to stay. At the door, Colton paused, turning to face her. In the soft lamplight, his features seemed more open than usual, the habitual guardedness momentarily absent. "Dahlia," he began, his voice low. "I've been thinking a lot these past few days, about you, about what happens next." Her heart quickened at his words. "Oh, I'm not a man who's had much permanence in his life," he continued carefully. "I've always moved on when a job was done, never looking back, but lately." He hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. "Lately?" Dahlia prompted softly when he didn't continue. Colton's eyes met hers, direct and serious. "Lately, I've been wondering what it might be like to stay somewhere, to build something lasting." The implications of his statement hung in the air between them. Dahlia's breath caught in her throat, hope and fear warring within her. "Colton," she began, but was interrupted by a sudden sharp pain that made her gasp and clutch her belly. Alarm flashed across Colton's face. "Dahlia, what is it?" "Just a pain," she managed, breathing through it. "It's past now, probably nothing to worry about." Colton looked unconvinced. "Maybe I should stay, just to be sure." "No, truly, I'm fine," Dahlia assured him, though another, milder twinge made her wince. "The baby's not due for weeks yet, doctor." Sullivan said these false pains are normal. After further protest and assurances, Colton reluctantly agreed to return to town, but only after extracting a promise from Dahlia that she would send Paul for the doctor if the pains worsened or became regular. "I'll be back tomorrow," Colton promised as he mounted his horse. "Earlier than today," Dahlia nodded, one hand resting protectively over her belly. "I'll look forward to it." That night the pains came and went, never establishing a pattern that suggested true labor. By morning they had subsided entirely, leaving Dahlia relieved but exhausted from a largely sleepless night. True to his word, Colton arrived mid-morning, his expression clearing from concern to relief when he saw Dahlia sitting on the porch, apparently well. "No more pains?" he asked immediately after dismounting. "None since dawn," she confirmed. "You were right to be concerned, but it seems it was a false alarm." The pattern established itself over the following week. Colton would arrive each day to work with Tempest, stay for the evening meal, and return to town as darkness fell. Each visit deepened the bond between them, filled with conversations that gradually became more personal, more revealing of their hopes and fears. Dahlia learned about Colton's years as an army scout, tracking both hostile warriors and lost soldiers across the frontier. He spoke of the loneliness of that life, the weight of responsibility when lives depended on his skills, the ghosts of those he couldn't save that still haunted his dreams. In turn, Dahlia shared stories of her childhood in Philadelphia, her father's early death from consumption, her mother's desperate attempts to arrange a suitable marriage for her only daughter. Meeting Thomas, who had come east to secure investors for his Montana venture, had seemed like an escape from the suffocating expectations of Philadelphia society. "Did you love him?" Colton asked one evening as they sat on the porch, the question simple but weighted with meaning. Dahlia considered carefully before answering. Yes, though perhaps not in the way romantic novels describe love. He was kind, hardworking, dedicated to building a life here. I respected him greatly. She paused, her fingers absently tracing patterns on her rounded belly. But there were things we never shared, depths we never reached with each other. I'm not sure if that was because those depths weren't there or if we simply never found the path to them. Colton nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. Some people go their whole lives without finding that path with another soul. Have you, Dahlia asked, suddenly bold, found that path with someone? A shadow passed over Colton's features. Once I thought I had, a young woman in Arizona Territory, daughter of a rancher I worked for briefly. But her father had other plans for her, and I was just a hired hand with no prospects. His mouth twisted slightly. She married a banker from Tucson, probably for the best. I'm sorry, Dahlia said softly. Colton shrugged, his expression clearing. It was a long time ago. And I've learned since that what I felt then was shallow compared to. He stopped, his eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away, compared to what's possible. The unfinished thought lingered between them, full of promise and uncertainty. On the 10th day after Colton's departure from the homestead, he arrived earlier than usual, leading a pack-horse loaded with supplies. What's all this? Dahlia asked, watching as he began unloading sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples onto her porch. Thought you might be running low on provisions, Colton explained, and with the baby coming soon, I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. Dahlia's throat tightened at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Thank you, that's very kind, not kindness, Colton corrected quietly. Care. Their eyes met over a sack of beans, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had grown too strong to be denied much longer. The moment was broken by the arrival of Paul, Jensen's nephew, who had come for his regular workday. The young man greeted them cheerfully, oblivious to the tension in the air. While Paul tended to the livestock, Colton worked with Tempest as usual. But today, he took a significant step forward in the Stallion's training, saddling him fully and riding him around the corral at a walk, then a gentle trot. Tempest responded beautifully, his previous wildness transformed into controlled power under Colton's guidance. He's ready, Colton announced when he finally dismounted and joined Dahlia at the fence. Tomorrow I'll take him out beyond the corral, let him get used to the open space with a rider. You've accomplished a miracle with him, Dahlia said admiringly. No one would believe he's the same horse that nearly trampled me. Colton's expression grew serious. That day seems both recent and a lifetime ago. So much has changed since then. Yes, Dahlia agreed softly, so much has changed. That evening, after Paul had gone home and supper was finished, they sat together by the fire. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, creating a cozy atmosphere within the cabin. Dahlia, Colton began, setting aside the small wooden horse he had been finishing. There's something I need to tell you, something I've been considering for some time now. The seriousness of his tone made Dahlia's heart quicken. What is it? Marshal Jenkins has offered me a permanent position, he said, his eyes intent on hers, as a deputy in Ruby City. It would mean staying in one place, having a steady income, a more settled life. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity, Dahlia said carefully, trying to gauge what this meant for them. Have you accepted? Not yet, Colton replied. I wanted to be sure. To know if there might be another reason for me to stay in Ruby City. Besides the job, Dahlia's breath caught as his meaning became clear. And is there another reason? Colton set aside his whittling and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. Dahlia, I've never been a man of many words, especially about feelings, but I need you to know that what I feel for you is deeper than anything I've known before. Tears pricked at Dahlia's eyes as joy and fear warred within her. Colton, please let me finish, he interrupted gently. I know it hasn't been long since Thomas passed. I know you're carrying his child, and I would never ask you to forget him or dishonor his memory. But I also know that life on the frontier is harsh and often short. When happiness presents itself, only a fool turns away. He took a deep breath, his blue eyes never leaving hers. I'm asking if there might be a place for me in your life, Dahlia, not just as a visitor, not just as Tempest's trainer, but as something more permanent, something we could build together. Dahlia's tears spilled over then, tracing warm paths down her cheeks. Oh, Colton, there's already a place for you in my life. There has been almost from the moment you caught that bridle and saved me. Relief and joy transformed Colton's features. He raised one hand to gently brush away her tears. I don't have much to offer except my heart and my hands, but both are yours if you'll have them. That's all I could ever ask for, Dahlia whispered slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Colton leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost reverent, but deepened as Dahlia responded, her hands coming up to frame his face. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Colton rested his forehead against hers. I love you, Dahlia Vance. Have for weeks now, if I'm honest with myself. And I love you, she replied, the words both frightening and freeing to speak aloud. More than I thought possible. That night, for the first time since leaving the homestead, Colton stayed. Not in the small room he had occupied during his recovery, but in Dahlia's bed, holding her close as they talked late into the night about the future they might build together. They agreed to wait until after the baby was born before making any formal announcement or arrangements. It was partly out of respect for Thomas's memory, partly to give themselves time to be certain of their feelings outside the isolation of the homestead. The next morning, Colton rode Tempest beyond the corral for the first time, the magnificent black stallion responding to his commands with eager intelligence. Dahlia watched from the porch, her heart full as she observed man and horse moving in perfect harmony across the rolling Montana landscape. When they returned, Colton dismounted and led Tempest to where Dahlia waited. Your turn, he said, holding out the reins to her. Dahlia stared at him in surprise. Now, but I haven't ridden in months and I'm hardly in condition to sit, Colton clarified, so he gets used to you. I'll hold him steady. After a moment's hesitation, Dahlia allowed Colton to help her mount, settling carefully into the saddle despite her awkward shape. Tempest stood perfectly still, his ears flicking occasionally but showing none of the nervous energy that had once defined him. He's so steady, Dahlia marveled, running a hand along the stallion's sleek neck. Like a completely different animal. He just needed someone to believe in him, Colton said, his eyes meeting hers with meaning that went beyond the horse. Sometimes that's all any of us need. The days that followed established a new pattern. Colton divided his time between Ruby City, where he began training with Marshal Jenkins, and the homestead, where he gradually moved his few possessions into Dahlia's cabin. They spoke openly of a future together, planning modest additions to the cabin to accommodate the growing family, discussing how to optimize the small ranch's productivity. Word of their relationship inevitably reached town, causing the expected ripples of gossip. But the hardships of frontier life had taught most residents of Ruby City that judgment was a luxury few could afford. Survival often depended on seizing happiness where it could be found, and second chances were too precious to waste on propriety's altar, Dr. Sullivan, during his regular check on Dahlia's pregnancy, offered gruff congratulations. Drake's a good man, the doctor said as he packed away his stethoscope. Steadier than most who pass through these parts. You've chosen well, Mrs. Vance. Thank you, Doctor, Dahlia replied, touched by his approval. Though I think perhaps we chose each other. As Dahlia's time grew nearer, Colton arranged to spend most nights at the homestead, riding into town only when his deputy duties required it. His protective instincts, always strong, intensified as Dahlia's due date approached. "You're hovering," she teased one evening as he insisted on bringing her a blanket despite the mild weather. "Can't help it," he admitted with a sheepish smile. "Never been around an expectant mother before." "It's both terrifying and amazing." "Terrifying," Dahlia echoed, amused. "The thought of something happening to you," Colton clarified, his expression sobering, "or to the little one." "I've tracked men across hundreds of miles of wilderness without batting an eye, but the idea of you going through childbirth." He shook his head. "Scares me more than any outlaw ever did." Dahlia reached for his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time, and Dr. Sullivan says everything looks normal. Still," Colton insisted, "I'll feel better when it's over and you're both safe." The moment came sooner than expected. 3 weeks before her calculated due date, Dahlia woke in the pre-dawn hours to the unmistakable sensation of her waters breaking. Colton, instantly alert at her gasp, was on his feet in seconds. "Is it time?" he asked, already reaching for his clothes. "I think so," Dahlia confirmed, wincing as the first contraction gripped her. "Earlier than we thought." With remarkable calm, Colton helped her change into a clean nightgown, then set about implementing the plans they had discussed for this moment. He stoked the fire, put water on to boil, laid out the clean linens Martha Sullivan had provided, and prepared to ride for the doctor. "I don't want to leave you," he said, visibly torn as he prepared to mount Tempest. "Go," Dahlia urged between contractions. "The pains are still far apart. You'll be back with Dr. Sullivan long before the baby comes." With a final worried glance, Colton swung onto Tempest's back and rode out at a gallop, the stallion seeming to understand the urgency as he stretched into his fastest pace. Alone in the cabin, Dahlia paced slowly, breathing through each contraction as Martha had instructed her. She thought of Thomas, feeling a pang that he would never know his child. But the sadness was tempered by gratitude for the unexpected gift of Colton's love. A second chance at happiness she had never anticipated. True to his word, Colton returned with Dr. Sullivan in what seemed like record time, Tempest's speed having cut the journey significantly. The doctor immediately took charge, his gruff exterior masking efficient competence. "First babies often take their time," he assured Dahlia after examining her, "but everything's progressing normally, nothing to worry about." The labor was long but uncomplicated. Throughout the day and into the evening, Dahlia worked through the increasingly intense contractions with Colton at her side. He never left the room despite Dr. Sullivan's suggestion that men typically waited elsewhere during birth, holding Dahlia's hand and wiping her brow with a damp cloth when the pains were at their worst. Finally, as midnight approached, the moment arrived. With a final, tremendous effort, Dahlia brought her child into the world, a healthy baby girl with a shock of dark hair and lusty lungs that announced her arrival with impressive volume. "She's perfect, Doctor," Sullivan declared, placing the swaddled infant in Dahlia's arms after cleaning and examining her. Small but strong, exhausted but elated, Dahlia gazed down at her daughter's tiny face. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Colton stood beside the bed, awe written across his features as he looked at the mother and child. When Dahlia held the baby toward him, he hesitated only briefly before carefully taking the small bundle into his arms. "She's so tiny," he marveled, his voice rough with emotion. "So perfect." "What will you name her?" Dr. Sullivan asked as he packed up his supplies. Dahlia and Colton exchanged a look. They had discussed this, reaching a decision that honored the past while embracing their future. "Eleanor," Dahlia said softly. "After Thomas's mother, Eleanor Tempest Vance." "Tempest." Dr. Sullivan repeated with raised eyebrows. Colton smiled, gently stroking the baby's cheek with one finger. "After the horse that brought us together," seemed fitting. After the doctor left, promising to return the next day to check on mother and child, Colton settled onto the bed beside Dahlia, his arm around her shoulders as they both gazed at the sleeping infant. "Thank you," he murmured against Dahlia's hair. For what? She asked, leaning into his solid warmth. For Eleanor, for letting me be part of this, for giving me a family when I thought I'd always be alone. We're the ones who should thank you, Dahlia countered softly. If not for you catching that bridle, neither of us might be here now. Colton's arm tightened around her. I don't think it was chance that brought me to that ridge at that exact moment. Some things are meant to be. Like a wild stallion and a pregnant widow, Dahlia asked with a small smile. And the man who found a home with them, Colton completed, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. 1 month after Eleanor's birth, on a perfect summer morning, Dahlia Vance became Dahlia Drake in a simple ceremony performed by Reverend Thompson on the porch of their homestead. Martha Sullivan held baby Eleanor, while Marshall Jenkins stood as witness. Tempest watched from the corral, his once wild spirit now channeled into protective devotion to the family that had claimed him. I still can't believe how much has changed in just a few months, Dahlia said that evening as they sat on the porch, Eleanor sleeping peacefully in her cradle beside them. From the day that Stallion charged at me to now, it seems almost like a dream. If it is, I hope we never wake up, Colton replied, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. In the corral, Tempest lifted his head, nickering softly at them as if in agreement. His once fear-filled eyes now watched the homestead with calm awareness, the terror and wildness replaced by belonging. What do you think he's thinking? Dahlia asked, nodding toward the stallion. Colton considered the magnificent horse for a moment. Probably the same thing I am, he said finally. And what's that? That some storms bring destruction, Colton said, his voice low and sincere. But others clear the air and make way for new beginnings. We just have to be brave enough to ride them out. As the Montana sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and gold, Dahlia rested her head against her husband's shoulder. The evening breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant promise of rain, not a threatening storm, but the gentle kind that nourishes the land and everything that grows upon it. In the corral, Tempest lowered his head to graze peacefully, secure in the knowledge that he had found his place in the world. And on the porch of the cabin that had once echoed with loneliness, a family born of courage and second chances watched the stars emerge, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the Montana sky. 5 years later, the homestead had grown along with the family that inhabited it. The original cabin had been expanded with additional rooms, the barn enlarged to accommodate more livestock, and the vegetable garden doubled in size. What had once been a modest widow's struggle for survival had transformed into a thriving small ranch under the careful stewardship of Colton and Dahlia Drake. Eleanor, now a sturdy 5-year-old with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes, chased butterflies in the yard while her 3-year-old brother, James Thomas Drake, toddled after her on less certain legs. From the porch, Dahlia watched them play, one hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her belly that announced another addition to the family expected in the winter. Tempest, now the undisputed patriarch of the small herd of horses in the expanded corral, lifted his head at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. His ears pricked forward in recognition moments before Dahlia spotted Colton riding over the ridge that marked the boundary of their property. Eleanor saw him too, her delighted cry of "Papa," carrying across the yard as she abandoned her butterfly chase to race toward her father. Colton dismounted in one fluid motion and swept his daughter into his arms, spinning her around as she giggled with delight. Setting her down, he ruffled James's hair as the boy reached them at a determined toddle, then strode toward the porch where Dahlia waited. "How are my girls today?" he asked, bending to kiss Dahlia tenderly before placing a gentle hand on her rounded middle. "And the little one?" "We're all well," Dahlia assured him, covering his hand with her own. "Though your son would object to being called one of your girls." Colton laughed, the sound rich and free in a way it had never been when Dahlia first met him. 5 years as Ruby City's deputy had given him the stability he'd never had, while marriage and fatherhood had healed wounds he'd carried since his own childhood losses. "Marshal Jenkins sends his regards," Colton said as they moved inside, the children following behind. "Says the territory governor's considering making Ruby City the county seat now that the new railway spur is coming through." "That would be good for business," Dahlia observed, moving to the stove where supper was cooking. "Is that why you're late, meeting about the railway?" Colton nodded, helping James into his chair at the table. "That and I stopped by the old Washburn place. Ethan's taking over from his father now that the arthritis has gotten bad. Boy's grown into a fine young man." "Hardly a boy anymore," Dahlia pointed out with a smile. "He's 18 now and taller than you." "True enough," Colton agreed. "Makes me feel my age." "Ancient at 35, Dahlia teased, setting a pot of stew on the table. "Practically decrepit." Their easy banter continued through the meal, interspersed with Aliner's excited accounts of the day's adventures and James's occasional word or phrase, his vocabulary growing daily. It was the comfortable rhythm of a family secure in their love for each other, built on a foundation stronger than the cabin's oak beams. Later, after the children were tucked into bed with stories of brave horses and the early days of Montana Territory, Colton and Dahlia sat on the porch as they had so many evenings before. Tempest and the other horses moved like shadows in the moonlight, their occasional soft nickering a familiar soundtrack to the night. "I got a letter today," Dahlia said quietly, leaning against Colton's shoulder. "From my mother." Colton's arm tightened around her slightly. Dahlia's relationship with her mother had been strained since her marriage to Colton, the Philadelphia widow disapproving of her daughter's quick remarriage to a frontier ruffian, as she had termed him in one particularly harsh letter. What did she have to say? Colton asked, his voice carefully neutral. Dahlia smiled, pulling the letter from her pocket. "She's coming to visit, next month if the weather holds and the trains run on time." "Your mother, here?" Colton couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "What changed her mind after all this time?" "Aliner's last letter, apparently," Dahlia explained. "I let her dictate a message to her grandmother, and it seems our daughter has a way with words. Mother says she can't bear the thought of never meeting her grandchildren, regardless of her reservations about our situation." Colton chuckled softly. "That sounds like a concession coming from her. Should I make myself scarce while she's here?" "Absolutely not," Dahlia said firmly. "You're my husband and the father of my children, all my children," she added, placing his hand on her belly where the new baby shifted restlessly. "Mother will simply have to accept that this is my life now and I've never been happier. Never." Colton asked, his tone light but with a hint of vulnerability that still surfaced occasionally, even after years together. Dahlia turned to face him, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "Never," she confirmed softly. "Not even close." In the corral, Tempest lifted his head again, as if sensing the depth of emotion flowing between the two humans who had given him a home. The stallion that had once been wild enough to charge down a pregnant woman had become the steady, reliable mount that had carried Colton through countless patrols as deputy, had pulled the wagon to town when Aliner was born, had taught both Drake children their first tentative rides. Like the family he had become part of, Tempest had found his place in a world that once seemed determined to break him. And like Colton and Dahlia, he had discovered that sometimes the storms that threaten to destroy us instead lead us exactly where we need to be, into the waiting arms of a love strong enough to gentle even the wildest heart.